Welcome to the debate.
Today, we're examining the immense and really enduring legacy of Kemet, what we call ancient Egypt, a civilization known as the Black Land.
Exactly. It was this incredible center of achievement, in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, all flourishing along the Nile for, over 3 millennia? And it was deeply, deeply connected to the wider African world, especially Nubia.
Right. And the source material is very clear that Eurocentric colonial powers committed a profound injustice against that legacy. A two-part injustice, really. They physically looted its treasures, and they also distorted its history.
And that brings us to our central disagreement today. Which of these colonial actions caused the more foundational, the more enduring injury? Was it the immediate physical plunder of all those material artifacts?
Or was it the long-term, sustained intellectual distortion, the racialized denial of Kemet's African origins?
I'm going to argue that the real structural damage, the deepest wound, lies in that sustained intellectual distortion. The ideological denial of Kemet's African identity is what provided the justification for global systemic oppression and, I think, stripped its descendants of their historical inheritance.
And I'll be coming at it from a different angle. I'll maintain that while the intellectual denial is a grave continuation of the injury, it was that initial organized physical plunder of sacred artifacts that was the essential turning point. That was the foundational act of violence that enabled everything that came after.
Well, for me, the core of the argument centers on the ideological necessity of the intellectual theft. The lasting damage stems directly from the rise of what we now call scientific racism back in the 1800s. And this wasn't just some passive misunderstanding of history. It was a deliberate, active project. You just have to look at the work of scholars like Samuel Morton. He didn't merely misinterpret data from Egyptian remains, he actively manipulated it. He focused almost exclusively on later dynasty remains that had more Mediterranean influence, while just ignoring the millennia of deep ties to Nubia. He literally invented racial categories to reclassify Egyptians as Caucasoid.
And this was in the face of direct evidence to the contrary.
Exactly. Direct contradiction of clear historical testimony, like Herodotus describing the Egyptians as, quote, dark-skinned with woolly hair. By doing that, by placing Kemet outside of Africa, they created the foundational lie they needed for centuries of exploitation.
That is a powerful argument about the ideological architecture of it all. But I would argue the physical appropriation is what paved the way for that intellectual denial to even take root. I mean, you can't effectively deny someone's ownership of a history if you don't first possess its physical proof, right? If you don't remove it from their control.
I see your point, but...
Well, just consider the scope of it. After Napoleon's invasion in 1798, this wasn't selective collecting. It was, as the source says, wholesale looting. We're talking about tens of thousands of priceless artifacts. The Rosetta Stone, the key to the entire language. Entire obelisks ripped from temple complexes, colossal statues, critical texts like the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which is foundational to the history of medicine. All of it shipped off to museums in London, Paris, Berlin, turning these sacred integral items into, mere trophies in foreign lands. That tangible theft disconnected generations of Africans from their inheritance immediately.
But those trophies only became powerful symbols of superiority because the intellectual framework had already decided that Africans were incapable of producing them in the first place. The physical theft was leveraged by the intellectual lie. And this intellectual gatekeeping, it continues to cause injury today. I mean, look at the concerted dismissal of rigorous scholarship from African scholars like Sheikh Anta Diop. Diop used linguistics, anthropology, deep cultural analysis to prove Kemet's clear African origins. And yet Western academia, the very institutions that house these stolen artifacts, just dismissed his work as Afrocentric. They refused to engage with its substance. By severing Kemet from its African roots with that intellectual maneuver, colonizers created the devastating lie that Africa was a continent without history. That ideology directly justified slavery, exploitation, apartheid. That kind of wound it's comprehensive. It's so much bigger than the loss of any single object.
I agree that the dismissal of Diop is a horrific continuation of that injury, but the physical act was structural in a very different way. The removal of the Rosetta Stone, for instance, it didn't just strip it of meaning, it denied generations of scholars in Africa access to the most fundamental key to their own history. The loss was functional. The source material talks about how Kemet's art and architecture revealed this profound commitment to beauty and meaning, and removing that art left a vacuum. And beyond that, the plunder established a very clear material precedent. It enriched European institutions, while the descendants of Kemet were denied access to the very evidence of their ancestors' genius.
So let's delve deeper into that. You're arguing that the physical objects embodied a sacred connection, and their removal established the material basis for what the source calls systemic bondage. Is that right? You see the theft as robbing African identity of its anchors?
Precisely. We have to understand these weren't just art objects in a gallery. They were integrated parts of a spiritual, a social landscape. When colossal statues from a temple or specific medicinal papyri were physically removed, it wasn't just aesthetic loss. It was a ritual and scientific severance. The fact that the Rosetta Stone now sits in a London museum, symbolizing British dominance over a land impoverished by that very system, that fundamentally embodies the whole contradiction. Cultural theft enabling material wealth accumulation.
That's a compelling point about material enrichment. I get that. But I would still argue that the loss of narrative control caused far greater, more pervasive harm. The symbolic loss of an artifact, however painful, is secondary to the loss of self-worth that was enforced on generations of people. The real damage was in the deliberate, state-sponsored miseducation through colonial school systems across Africa and the diaspora. These schools taught that civilization was a gift from Europe.
Right.
That intellectual erasure fueled feelings of inferiority, spiritual trauma, things far deeper than the absence of a statue in a temple. The stolen objects are crucial symbols. Yes, I grant you that. But the stolen history is the ideological foundation used to deny African people their humanity and their right to self-determination for centuries.
I find that compelling. But it forces us to look at chronology and motivation. You seem to be saying the intellectual distortion was a prerequisite, that scientific racism had to be fully formed before the theft could even happen.
I maintain that the necessity of creating scientific racism, which involved, blatant manipulation of evidence and ignoring the Kemet-Nubia connection, it shows the motivation was explicitly ideological. It was about maintaining a racial hierarchy. The sheer effort it took to twist the evidence proves that the intellectual distortion was fundamental to justifying the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism. You have to first erase a civilization to justify enslaving its descendants.
I'm just not completely convinced by that timeline. The foundational moment of mass theft started long before sophisticated scientific racism was fully formalized by people like Morton. After Napoleon's expedition, the immediate motivation was just expedient, imperial accumulation, wealth, prestige. The huge waves of removal happened in the 1820s and 30s. Morton's big theories came after that initial plunder. It feels more like a post hoc justification, a way to legitimize keeping the loot they'd already taken.
Okay, that's a crucial distinction. Accumulation versus formalized ideology. But the ideology was nascent, even in Napoleon's time. The very act of the French setting up the Description de l'Égypte, this huge project to systematically document and claim intellectual ownership of Kemet, that shows an intellectual appropriation happening in parallel with the physical extraction.
True, but let's look at the ongoing impact, which I think ties them together. The appropriation continued into the 20th century, not just in academia, but in popular media. Think of Hollywood films like Cleopatra or The Mummy. They systematically cast white actors, reinforcing the sanitized, whitewashed version of Kemet for mass consumption. This goes beyond academic racism. It confirms that the continued display of stolen physical artifacts in foreign museums reinforces the lie of the whitewashed history. The plunder provided the stage for the distortion to become entertainment.
I agree that media distortion is powerful, but it's just the transmission mechanism for the intellectual lie. So if we're talking about reclaiming the legacy today, the solution has to address the root cause, which is intellectual gatekeeping. It requires Western academia to finally engage with scholarship like Diop's. Restoring historical pride requires restoring the narrative, which acknowledges Kemet as a civilization rooted in Africa, shaped by its people. We have to win the intellectual war.
That's a necessary fight. But have you considered that the material return of these artifacts is the necessary first step? You can't fully restore a narrative if the primary physical evidence is held hostage in foreign museums. For the diaspora, still healing from being stripped of language, custom, and story, the physical object acts as the undeniable proof against the narrative of erasure. Returning these items isn't just logistics, it's a fundamental act of justice that empowers the intellectual and cultural revival.
In the end, I worry that focusing on the material return distracts from the core structural damage. If the Rosetta Stone is returned but the world's academic infrastructure still denies Kemet's African identity, the harm persists. The power of the intellectual theft lies in its ubiquity. It dictates educational policy, cultural investment, how people see themselves. Reclaiming the truth of history is a narrative fight that has to be won.
And I still hold that the physical looting was the first and most definitive act of violence. It created that immediate, tangible disconnection from cultural inheritance. This theft cemented Kemet's treasures as symbols of imperial dominance, proving that the foundation of the whole colonial project was rooted first in the appropriation of material wealth and sacred objects.
Ultimately, it's clear both thefts were integral to the colonial project, working in chilling parallel to undermine African historical standing.
And understanding that interplay between the physical removal of treasures and the sustained academic denial is essential to appreciating the full, painful complexity of Kemet's enduring legacy.
Absolutely. And recognizing the historical resilience and creativity of African peoples, who continue to fight to reclaim both the physical artifacts and the intellectual truths, it suggests there's a profound and vital journey still ahead.